Two people sit down to the same meal. Same dish, same chili, same kitchen. One of them takes a bite and barely reacts. The other's eyes water, their face flushes, and they're reaching for water before they even swallow. Same food, completely different experience. And here's what nobody tells you. That difference isn't about willpower. It isn't about culture or toughness or how much hot sauce you grew up with. A significant part of that difference is written into your DNA before you ever tasted a single pepper in your life. Let's start with something that surprises most people. Spicy food isn't actually a taste. Your tongue has receptors for sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. There is no receptor for spicy. What you experience as heat or burn when you eat a chili pepper is not a flavor signal at all. It's a pain signal. When capsaicin, the active compound in hot peppers, enters your mouth, it doesn't activate your taste system. It activates your pain and heat detection system. Your brain receives the exact same kind of warning signal it would receive if you pressed your hand against a hot stove. The pepper isn't actually burning you. Nothing is physically damaged. But your nervous system is convinced that something is, and it responds accordingly. That's why spicy food makes you sweat, raises your heart rate, and triggers the release of endorphins. Your body is responding to a perceived threat with its full emergency toolkit. The gatekeeper of all of this is a protein called TRPV1, the transient receptor potential vanilloid 1 receptor. This receptor sits on nerve endings throughout your mouth, throat, and digestive tract, and its entire job is to detect dangerous heat. Normally, TRPV1 activates when tissue temperature exceeds around 43 degrees Celsius, the threshold where heat starts causing real damage. Capsaicin is a chemical key that fits directly into this receptor and forces it open without any actual heat being present. The receptor cannot tell the difference. It fires the same alarm either way. The signal travels up through your nervous system and your brain registers burning pain. That's the biology underneath every spicy meal you've ever eaten. Now here's where your DNA enters the picture. The gene that encodes TRPV1 contains natural variations across the human population. These aren't mutations in the alarming sense. They're normal inherited differences in how the receptor is built and how sensitively it responds. Some variants produce a TRPV1 receptor with a lower activation threshold, meaning it takes very little capsaicin to trigger a strong pain signal. Other variants produce a receptor that requires significantly more capsaicin before it fires at the same intensity. Research has identified multiple single nucleotide polymorphisms, tiny single-letter changes in the genetic code that directly influence how vigorously this receptor responds to capsaicin. What this means in practical terms is that two people eating the same pepper can experience genuinely different levels of pain, not a different interpretation of the same pain, different levels of actual neurological signal strength. Beyond TRPV1, genetic variation also influences the density of nerve endings in oral tissue and how quickly your nervous system recovers between signals. People with higher concentrations of capsaicin-sensitive nerve fibers simply have more receptors available to be activated at any given moment. More receptors firing simultaneously means a more intense perceived burn. This is not something you decide. You inherit it. And variation in genes connected to pain modulation pathways can further amplify or dampen the overall signal your brain ultimately registers. Your perception of spice intensity is the end result of a biological cascade that starts in your genome long before you ever touch a chili pepper. This matters because it fundamentally changes the conversation around spice tolerance. When someone says they just can't handle spicy food, or when someone else effortlessly eats something that would leave most people speechless, that gap is not primarily a personality difference. It is not a question of mental toughness or culinary sophistication. People with more sensitive TRPV1 variants are not being dramatic. They are experiencing a genuinely stronger pain response from the same input. The biology is different, so the experience is different. Understanding that distinction is important, because dismissing someone's spice sensitivity as weakness ignores the actual science of what is happening inside their nervous system. That said, genetics is not the only chapter in this story, and this is where the picture becomes more interesting than a simple nature versus nurture debate. Regular exposure to capsaicin is known to cause a process called desensitization. Repeated activation of TRPV1 receptors can temporarily deplete a neurotransmitter called substance P, which is critical for relaying pain signals. It can also cause a gradual reduction in receptor sensitivity over time. This is why people who eat spicy food regularly often report being able to handle more heat than they could years earlier. Their genetic baseline hasn't changed, but their nervous system has adapted to the input it keeps receiving. So the central question sitting at the heart of all of this is genuinely fascinating. How much of your relationship with spicy food was determined the moment your DNA was assembled? And how much have you actually built through experience? How much of what feels like a personal preference or a learned tolerance is actually a conversation between inherited biology and a lifetime of choices? Because as it turns out, your genes set the starting point. But they may not be the final word. And that distinction between what you were born with and what your body has learned to handle is exactly what the science of spice sensitivity is starting to unravel. Your genes set the stage, but they don't write the whole story. So here's where the picture gets more complicated and more honest. Because knowing that TRPV1 variation exists, knowing that your genetic code influences how intensely you feel capsaicin, might lead you to assume that a DNA test could hand you a clean, precise spice tolerance score. High sensitivity, low sensitivity. Problem solved. But that's not how genetics works. And the gap between what your genes can tell you and what people assume they can tell you is significant. Your DNA may suggest a tendency. A lean in one direction. People who carry certain TRPV1 variants associated with lower activation thresholds are more likely, statistically, to experience stronger pain responses to capsaicin. That is real, but statistically more likely is not the same as guaranteed. Genetic influences on complex sensory traits are probabilistic, not deterministic. Your genome is not issuing commands. It's setting up a default. And defaults can be overridden, modified, and reshaped by everything that happens after you're born. Think about what actually shapes your day-to-day relationship with spicy food. Repeated exposure is one of the most powerful forces at work. If you grew up eating chili-laced food at every meal from childhood, your TRPV1 receptors have been activated thousands upon thousands of times. That chronic activation drives real neurological adaptation. Your nervous system is not the same as it was at baseline. It has structurally and chemically responded to the input you kept giving it. A person with a genetically sensitive TRPV1 variant who grew up in a culture built around fiery cuisine may actually have a higher functional tolerance than someone with a low sensitivity variant who has barely encountered black pepper. The gene did not disappear, but the environment rewrote how it expresses itself in daily life. Age plays a role too. Children tend to have higher overall sensory sensitivity, and many people report that their ability to handle heat increases across decades of life. Health conditions matter. Gastrointestinal inflammation, acid reflux, and certain medications can all heighten pain sensitivity throughout the digestive system, making spice feel sharper regardless of your genetic profile. Even your emotional state on a given day can shift your pain perception threshold, which means the same meal can hit differently depending on stress, sleep, and physiological context that has nothing to do with your DNA. There's also a critical distinction that often gets lost in this conversation. Immediate pain sensitivity and long-term tolerance are not the same thing. Even if you have a genetically lower threshold for capsaicin activation, meaning your first encounter with a hot pepper produces a strong pain signal, that does not necessarily predict how you'll respond after months or years of regular exposure. Immediate sensitivity is more tightly tied to your genetic baseline. Long-term tolerance is far more shaped by adaptation, habit, and learning. Conflating the two leads to a lot of confusion. Someone who reacts strongly to spice the first time they encounter it is not biologically locked into that reaction forever. This brings us to something worth saying clearly about consumer DNA testing. The genetic insights available through direct-to-consumer services are improving, but they are still limited. Most focus on a small number of well-studied variants and report tendencies rather than certainties. If a DNA report tells you that you have genetic markers associated with higher spice sensitivity, that is a data point, not a diagnosis. It reflects population-level probabilities derived from research studies. It does not account for your specific lifetime of exposure, your culture, your habits, or the dozens of other genetic and environmental variables interacting simultaneously. Treat it as a starting point for curiosity, not a final answer about what your body can handle. Here is something far more reliable than any report. Your own body tested gradually and observed carefully. If you want to genuinely understand your personal tolerance, The most effective method is incremental exposure. Start with mild heat. Pay attention not just to how intense the burn feels, but to how quickly it builds, how long it lingers, and how your body responds afterward. Do you experience significant stomach discomfort? Does the heat fade within a minute or persist much longer? These responses tell you things about your nervous system that no current genetic panel can fully capture. Give your body time between experiments. Track what you notice. That kind of self-observation builds a picture that is specific to you, not to a population average. If you want to build higher tolerance over time, consistency is the mechanism. Small, regular increases in heat level over weeks and months allow your TRPV1 receptors to desensitize progressively without overwhelming your system. This is not about suffering through more pain to prove something. It's about giving your nervous system enough repetition to adapt at a pace it can manage. People who have done this successfully are not genetically different from who they were when they started. They have simply used exposure to shift their functional baseline. But here's the thing. There is no biological requirement to push your tolerance higher. If your genes and your history combine to make high heat genuinely uncomfortable, that is a legitimate physiological reality. You are not failing a test. You are responding to a real signal. And if spicy food brings you nothing but pain and no enjoyment, there is no data suggesting you are missing out on something your body needs. So here's the takeaway. Your genes shape the starting point. They influence how loudly your nervous system announces the arrival of capsaicin. But they are not destiny. What you eat, how often you eat it, the culture you grew up in, the age you are now, and the choices you make going forward all help determine where that starting point takes you. Your DNA handed you a draft. Everything since has been the revision. And that part, you still get to write. If this made you think differently about something you've eaten your whole life, leave a comment and tell me. I read every single one.